Welcome to my presentation on visual metaphor in art and design. Before we begin, I'd like to make a couple comments about metaphor in general. Current scholarship understands metaphor as a cognitive device, something that the mind uses, something that the mind uses to understand our world as something, metaphor is something very fundamental to the way that the mind and the brain works, rather than as an element of style that you may have learned about in, say, literature class or English class. In cognitive linguistics, conceptual metaphor refers to the understanding of one idea or one concept in terms of another, or one domain in terms of another. For instance, the notion that up is good and down is bad. The painting that I used on slide number 1 is by Honoré Scherer. It can be found in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It was painted in 1943. If you notice, we see a series of working class folks who are holding various famous artworks. And if you look at the artworks and then compare the artworks to what we see around the people, we notice a discrepancy. So this artwork is, on the one hand, offering up these images, these famous artworks, kind of like visual metaphors for understanding the world or understanding art or how things are, and yet the environment and the circumstances of the people are showing a discrepancy between what the artworks seem to be communicating and the lived reality of the people that are holding the artworks. The irony, of course, being that the work as a whole is still a visual metaphor for a way of understanding the world and a way of understanding art. But why visual metaphor? Why would we think about metaphor or visual metaphor in relationship to art and design? Or why would you think about it in terms of your own artwork? First, as I mentioned, some cognitive scientists have come to believe that metaphor, the ability to make analogies from one thing to another to understand one thing in terms of something else, is not only a basic cognitive function, but perhaps it's a primary cognitive function, something that's really essential to the ways that we think and reason and make meaning, something that our ability to make meaning relies on. Looking at your own artwork in terms of metaphor, in terms of the comparisons, the similarities, the differences you are building off of, and what you are working towards can reveal deeper levels of your thinking. Of course, we often think we already know what our artwork is about. I mean, I do that sometimes too. Even though I've had decades of experience as an artist, our brain is kind of arrogant. In fact, there's a word for it. It's called the availability heuristic. All right, it's been identified by a lot of researchers. There's a lot of evidence for it that this happens. The availability heuristic essentially is what the brain does when it's presented with a situation and it has to fill in a gap really fast so that it can keep functioning and keep moving forward. So for instance, have you ever been reading a book, come across a word that you didn't understand, and instead of looking it up, your brain just kind of, oh, it must mean this. It plops in a meaning or some kind of association with that word, and you keep going. If it seems to still make sense after you got to the end of the paragraph or the end of the page, good enough. You may not really know what that word means. In fact, sometimes, I don't know if you've had this experience, but maybe you come back to it later and you realize, oh, I thought this word meant this, but it really means that. Well, our availability heuristic, one of the functions of our brain, just kind of plops something in there so we could keep reading, right? Often our guesses are pretty good, sometimes not so good. This is also a reason why we have implicit bias, so that, for instance, in human resources, as people are going through applications for jobs and they're deciding who to select to reach out to, maybe for an interview or a follow-up, it's been found that if a name looks for instance, African American or maybe foreign, there's a tendency. This isn't like 100% of the time, but there is a greater tendency for that person's application to not result in a follow-up interview, even when the credentials are the same. So there's something really good about the availability heuristic. Our brain just plopping something in there so that we can keep going with the world. But sometimes it's not such a hot thing. Well, we think that we know what our art is about, but it sometimes helps if we kind of put that assumption on pause and kind of try to rethink maybe where our art is going, where it's come from, what possible connections the artwork might have to other things. Sometimes I say that your job as an artist, or that you know when you're really functioning as an artist, that only starts when you don't know what your work is about, when you don't know the next step, but you sense that there's something that's there, that's an underlying connection or a thread of significance, and but your searching can't quite articulate it yet, that your goal as an artist is to create something that teaches you something new in a very deep and authentic way that might not reveal itself for a long time. I've had the experience where I know that a painting is working. I knew that this piece of work was working, but I didn't really understand what it was, what it really meant, what it was all about, for maybe even a year after I finished it. With this in mind, I want to investigate what might be the hidden roots or the underlying structure of our artistic thinking and making, and to do this by talking about metaphor. Also, understanding visual metaphor is a good tool for developing your existing ideas and coming up with new ones.